Lots of you. Good morning. My name is Dasha Estalilla, and so Matt asked me to speak to the culture, and so when James started talking, I was like, dang, he's gonna rip all the words out of out of my mouth, and I don't know what I'm gonna talk about. So he didn't, thankfully. So I have a little bit to share about my culture. I brought it up a little bit. For those who don't know, I grew up in Russia, was born in Russia, was raised there. I became a Christian at about the age of 10, and at the time, so this was early 90s, the Soviet Union had just fallen apart, and the borders were opened, and a lot of American and other countries' missionaries came to Russia to preach the gospel because finally they could. And the timer is not on, by the way. And that happened to my hometown. We already had a tiny bit of a church with maybe 10 people in it. I was not a part of it. I did not know. I did not care. I was a 10-year-old. But then there was a big crusade, and a church just exploded. And that is when my mom heard the gospel, and I heard the gospel, and I realized that at 10 years old, I have done some things for which I need forgiveness, and I asked God to forgive me of them. But the culture, Russian culture, is very different, and I believe that the church in Russia, the way, particularly my church, was heavily influenced, obviously, by the denomination of whatever missionaries were, whatever denomination that sent the missionaries to us. So I'm going to share some of the interesting facts about what the church culture in my church was, and still is probably. And by the way, Katya Kennedy, we grew up together in the same church from about the same age, except for I moved to the United States 18 years ago, and she 3.5. Wild God's providence, but here we are. We've known each other since we were your guys' age. So I wish she was here to kind of affirm me in this, but whatever, she's having fun. So she's in Soldana. So what is culture? Guys, you have heard something. I want to hear from you. What do you think culture is? You front row and second row, right there. Come on, don't be shy. Societal norms and expectations, okay. Anybody? Okay. All right. Jackson, any ideas? Okay. Well, how about this? I'm going to give you the definition of what culture is, according to the Oxford Dictionary. It is the customs, arts, social institutions, like a church, and achievements of a particular people, nation, or social group, like a church, and the attitudes and the behavioral characteristics, so the way we think, the attitudes that we have, and the characteristics of our behavior that we exhibit. That is our culture. So in our church, the culture is that we have different worship teams come, and different preachers come, and it's okay for the congregation members to raise their hand and to speak up in the middle of a sermon and ask questions and offer feedback. It is not the same in many different churches. So that is a different culture altogether. So culture is the way of life. It is the way your family operates. It is your community, like our community. It is your friends. They create your culture. It is what and how you choose to spend your money on. It is the way you entertain yourself. It is how you spend your time. It is your family's dynamics. So whether you maybe live with a single parent, maybe your dad, maybe only your mom, maybe you have a blended family, maybe you have adopted siblings. So all of those things create your culture. It is what you choose to look like. That is the very big thing in our culture is you identify or you show how you identify yourself by the way you choose to look. Be it clothes, makeup, hair, tattoos, piercings, all of those things make culture. It is what you choose to eat. Vegan, paleo, keto, whatever is there, you name it. It is what you consider beautiful and valuable, so like art, music, aesthetics, trends, and it is even down to the way you say things. Pop versus soda, four-wheeling versus quadding. My children telling me that in their Christian church, a Bible teacher from the South was like, who says four-wheeling? Like, bro, Alaskans do. He's from lower 48, and so on. So all those things create your culture. For example, Jews, in their culture, they believe that even eating with people who are not of their culture was prohibitive. They could not do this. They would not do this. So in Russia, story time. For example, some of the different things. So we did communion today. In my church and in Katya's church where we grew up, communion would be done this way. We would have a goblet, one single goblet, and mind you, the church was about 300 people. One single goblet with real wine, and the bread was not cut up, and it was specifically made for the communion with flour and oil. So it was torn by hand in front of everybody, and the whole church lined up, and everybody took a sip of the goblet and grabbed a piece of bread. And it was just like, it took a solid hour for that to happen. Dating, for example. You're not allowed to date in my church. Like, you could not have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Amen, yes. I have teenagers. Yes, no, we're taking that from Russia and bringing here. You're not allowed to date. But the way they would do it, they would announce an engagement. So if the couple kind of realize that they have, sparks for each other and they're like, we want to pursue this, they would go see the leadership of the church and they'd say, we would like to be in a relationship to see if this works out. And so they would announce an engagement in front of everybody. Weird. It is cool, but it also, I've experienced this to be also very intrusive because, they had to announce my engagement to my husband in my church, and it was like, that's none of y'all business. But, and so if the engagement did not work out, then they would announce that it did not work out, and so they knew, okay, this couple is no longer together. Alcohol. I am not going to preach about what you should or should not believe about alcohol, but what I'm going to say, in Russia, as James pointed out, we like to party. Party equals vodka. So in Russia, being a Christian, that means that you give up drinking. Full stop. Because it was so countercultural to Russian general culture that in a church, you assume new identity and you give up the right. You give up that identity of a Russian partier who drinks vodka like it's water. And because there was no also just culture of drinking alcohol responsibly. Cards, playing cards. You could not play cards. I have no idea why, but it was not godly to play cards in my church. Yep, I don't know why. Also, when you became a Christian, you were labeled a sect. Like you were part of a sect is like a cult, which is, we know, is extra biblical. It is not of the Lord, and people who are in a cult here in the US, they do some weird things. So Russians believe that you being a non-Russian Orthodox Christian, you're being weird and you're being in a sect. So there are differences in culture, vast, and I had to adjust when I first came here. Also, not part of the church culture, but for me, a huge shock was having firearms around. In Russia, nobody's allowed to have firearms. We're Alaskans. There's about 58% of the households have at least one firearm in their house. Yes. So when I came and I married my husband and I moved into the house and he had a handgun under his pillow, that was wild to me. But that's America for you. So we can separate ourselves from the culture that we are in. We're in it and it is around us. So what does God want from us? It is important for him how his children interact with the culture. So Bible time. I'm almost done. It's going to go off, but bear with me. Romans 12:2 says, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." No culture is perfect. And God calls us to not conform to the world, meaning the world, the culture of this world, or any world for that matter. 1 John 2:15-17 tells us, "Do not love the world or the things in the world," meaning the things that are around you, that what you are immersed in. "If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and the pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires. But whoever does the will of God abides forever." Colossians 2:8 tells us, "See that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to the human tradition, the culture, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ." What does this mean? God calls us. He placed us in this culture because we can't be outside of the culture. Otherwise, we'd be Amish and living in our own commune and be completely separate from the world and have no electricity or running water and would have to go get our own eggs from the chickens and also till the fields and do everything on our own, down to making our own clothes. But that's not what God calls us to. God calls us not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of our mind, and not be taken captive by the philosophy and the empty deceit according to the human tradition. Humans can come up with so many different rules and so many different regulations and so many different things, but God, in 1 Corinthians 10:31, "Whether you eat or drink or whatever you do." I feel like we skim over that word just very quickly. Oh, it's about food and drink. No, it says whatever. That is all inclusive. It means everything, anything, all the things that you do. Do it all for the glory of God. God calls us to live in the culture, not be of this world, influence the culture by the choices that we make that glorify God, and that is how we represent God in culture to the people who do not know him and who do know him. Thank you.